My son sat at my kitchen table the way he used to when he was 9 years old and had broken something. Jacket folded over his arm, eyes not quite meeting mine. 30 years and the posture hadn't changed at all. I noticed the soup on the stove had gone cold an hour ago. I hadn't noticed until right then, standing there with the kettle still in my hand. I poured 2 cups of tea. He hadn't asked for one. I set his down in front of him and kept mine, and I didn't examine too closely why I'd made two. Some habits don't wait for permission. I pulled out my chair and sat down across from him the way I had 10,000 times before. The bank needs your personal guarantee by Friday, he said. The Meridian line collapses without it. I stirred my tea and asked which loan officer specifically. He said I knew which bank. I repeated the question. He said, Dad. I said, Cal, your investors. Something moved across his face then, not anger, not surprise. Recognition. Like a man who'd planned for every response except the one he got. Before I tell you how we ended up in that kitchen, if stories like this stay with you, please subscribe to Familix's Revenge. Means more than you know. Let me take you back 40 years to where this actually started. I started Caldwell Manufacturing with a 12,000 loan and a second-hand press machine that the previous owner swore was reliable. It wasn't. First week it jammed 4 times. I fixed it myself each time, because I couldn't afford to call anyone. That machine and I had an understanding by the end of the month. It would run, and I wouldn't sleep. We kept that arrangement for about 3 years. My wife Margaret used to pack sandwiches in a brown paper bag and drive them to the factory floor at midnight when I was running the second shift alone. She never complained. Not once in 22 years. I still have one of those bags in the back of a kitchen drawer. I don't know why I keep it. I do know why. I just don't say it out loud. The factory grew the way things grow when you don't stop, slowly, then suddenly. 200 workers by the time Marcus was in high school. Export contracts. A proper board table instead of the folding one I'd used for the first 8 years. Margaret came to the opening of the second facility and stood in the doorway and looked at the floor space and said, Ray, you actually did it. She sounded surprised. I loved her for that. Marcus grew up doing homework at the desk in my office, while the machines ran outside the glass. He was 8 years old when I first showed him how to read a production log. I told him something I believed completely at the time. Every bolt you tighten with your name on it. He nodded seriously the way kids do when they're storing something away. I thought he was storing the lesson. Maybe he was. Maybe he just stored it differently than I meant. When Marcus joined the company at 28, he was sharp in ways I recognized and ambitious in ways I didn't always know how to handle. I'll say this plainly because it matters later. I was a difficult man to work for. I approved every invoice myself. He'd bring ideas to meetings and I'd listen carefully, and then do what I'd already decided. I called it maintaining standards. I know now what he called it. The word he used was probably different from mine, and he probably wasn't wrong. The changes started quietly. New vocabulary appeared in board meetings, words like scalability and capital efficiency that I nodded at without asking what they meant. Marcus started presenting numbers I hadn't seen being assembled. I told myself he was modernizing the reporting structure. Told myself that was good. I was right about one of those things. The board meeting agendas started arriving the morning of, instead of 3 days before. Small thing. I noticed it and filed it somewhere I didn't look too often. The new CFO, Brian Kowalski, I'd shaken his hand once in a hallway, and that was the full extent of our relationship. A slide deck appeared at one meeting with a new logo treatment I hadn't approved. When I asked Marcus about the shareholder register, he said he'd get it to me. That was 11 weeks before I stopped asking. On a Sunday morning, Earl Thompson came to my back porch with a coffee he'd bought himself on the way over. Earl had worked my factory floor for 22 years. He sat down and we talked about the gutters I'd been meaning to fix and a tolerance issue on line 3. He held his cup with both hands and didn't look at me directly, and I knew before he said anything that he hadn't come about the gutters. When he finally set his cup down, he told me what he'd heard through the CFO's office door 3 weeks earlier: voting restructure, Class B shares, non-voting, and that the CFO had sounded like he was reporting good news. Earl said he'd been asking himself for 3 weeks if he'd heard correctly. I asked him why he'd waited. He said, because I couldn't keep coming to work and then he stopped. Said, anyway, left his coffee half finished and went home. I hired a lawyer that week. Small firm. Someone a friend had recommended. I gave him partial information. Couldn't bring myself to hand over everything, because handing over everything would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. The lawyer reviewed what I gave him and found nothing irregular. I drove home and sat in my car outside my own house for 11 minutes telling myself Earl had misheard. I knew he hadn't. That's the part I'm least proud of, not what Marcus did, what I chose not to confirm. The board meeting was on a Tuesday. My name was on a placard at the table the way it had been for 20 years. Marcus presented, new ownership structure, investor names I didn't recognize, a slide titled, Leadership Continuity Framework, in a font nobody had asked me about. The vote was 4-1. I realized somewhere in the middle of it that my vote had never been part of the calculation. Not that day, and probably not for longer than I wanted to work out. Through the glass partition on the far wall, I could see Earl on the factory floor, not working, just standing there watching the room. Marcus said the company needed to move faster, and this structure would allow that. Then he said it was just business. I looked at my son and started to say something, some version of why, some version of how could you, and then I couldn't find the shape of it. So I asked him instead, quietly, whether his mother would have known he was going to do this. He didn't answer. I picked up my book, same one I'd carried into that room for 2 decades, and walked out. I didn't slam the door. Didn't occur to me to. Behind me I heard Marcus say my name once, the way you say someone's name when you've prepared for everything except silence, and I kept walking. They sent documents over the following weeks, and I signed every one of them. No lawyer, no delay, no scene. Marcus had prepared for a fight, and I gave him nothing to fight against, which I could tell unsettled him more than anger would have. But while I was signing, I was also writing. Same book, back pages, 3 items. Personal guarantee with National Bank, withdraw at next renewal. Call Dave Reinhold directly, personal conversation only. Lunch with Whitfields, Meridian, Eastern Coast Supply. My relationships, built over 18 years, not transferable to a corporate title. The meeting with Dave Reinhold was short. We'd known each other since before Marcus could drive. He asked how retirement was treating me, and I told him I wanted to formalize something. Any personal guarantees on file should be treated as personal going forward, not institutional. He said that was a significant change. I said it was a clarification. He asked if Marcus knew. I told him the company had its own officers now. Dave nodded the way people nod when they understand something they're not going to say out loud. And we shook hands, and I drove home. And for the first time since that Sunday on the porch with Earl, I slept through the night. Over the next 2 months I had lunch with 3 clients, Whitfields, Meridian, Eastern Coast Supply. Old relationships, the kind built on handshakes before contracts existed. At each lunch I said some version of the same thing. Marcus was running everything now. I trusted him fully. He had good people around him. Said it warmly. Meant every word as a signal. These men had done business with me personally for 15 and 20 years, not with Caldwell Manufacturing, with Ray Caldwell. And they heard what I was telling them the way people who've known you a long time hear things. Marcus invited me to Tyler's 7th birthday in the spring, and I went, because not going would have meant something I wasn't ready to mean. Tyler tore through his gifts the way kids do, when they're genuinely surprised by every single one, and Marcus was good with him, patient, present, the kind of father who gets down on the floor. That wasn't comfortable to watch. I sat next to Tyler on the couch after the cake, while he was falling asleep, and Marcus came and sat on the other end, and neither of us spoke. Then Marcus said my name and started to say we should talk, and I said his mother would have loved today. And that closed the conversation the way I knew it would. On the drive home I took the exit ramp, and had my hand on the wheel and genuinely considered turning around. 1 phone call. Dinner somewhere. 3 months from now the bank paperwork reversed and we're, what, exactly? Pretending the board meeting was a misunderstanding. Pretending the back pages of that book didn't exist. I took the highway home. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you that like it was easy. Earl called about 3 months before everything came apart. We talked about nothing for a minute, and then he said the Columbus facility numbers weren't adding up, and some of the longer-serving workers were worried. I asked him directly whether he trusted Marcus to run the company. There was a pause long enough that I didn't need to hear the answer. I told him to update his resume quietly, and that I'd be a reference whenever he needed one. He started to ask if I was going to do something, and I told him I was retired. After I hung up I read about Caldwell Manufacturing's aggressive regional expansion in a trade brief, new Columbus facility, a forced $2 million equipment loan, international distribution agreements. I opened the book to a clean page and wrote 2 words. Over, leveraged, closed it. Put it back in the drawer. The economy tightened that fall the way it does every several years. Import costs spiked. 2 major export contracts canceled industry-wide. Credit lines that had been comfortable suddenly weren't. I'd seen it before in 1991 and again in 2001. And I knew what it did to companies that had expanded faster than their foundations could support. The Columbus facility went quiet on a Wednesday. I read it in a trade brief. Operations suspended pending restructure. 8 words representing 4 years of Marcus's work and 18 years of mine. Marcus's CFO ran the numbers sometime in October and found the gap. The personal guarantees that had anchored the national bank relationship for 18 years withdrawn. The informal trust that had kept 3 credit lines open through 2 previous downturns. Gone with the man who'd built it. I know Marcus made at least 3 calls trying to find another way around it, because Dave Reinhold mentioned it to me later. Professionally, the way Dave does everything. Each call ended the same way. They needed Ray Caldwell's signature. Ray Caldwell was retired. I was at the kitchen window when Marcus pulled up. He sat in his car longer than necessary before getting out. I watched him, that particular stillness of a person preparing for something. He stopped on the front path and straightened his jacket, and then took it off and folded it over his arm. I turned back to the stove and turned the burner off under the soup and poured 2 cups of tea. I'd made 2. Didn't examine that too carefully. He sat down. Didn't touch the tea. Told me about the bank, the Friday deadline, the Meridian line. I asked which loan officer specifically. He said I knew which bank. I asked again. He said my name the way he used to when he was a teenager, and thought I was being deliberately difficult. I told him to call his investors. He said they were pulling out. I nodded and set my spoon down carefully and told him that sounded like a problem. He tried the workers then. 57 families, Columbus facility. I told him not to do that he hadn't brought the workers to the board meeting 3 years ago, and he shouldn't bring them to my kitchen now. That landed. I could see it land. He went quieter and said he'd made a mistake, that there had been better ways to handle the transition, that he should have, and I said yes. Just that. He said, but the company, and I said the company was his. He said he couldn't save it without me. And I stood up and went to the window, because I needed something to look at that wasn't his face. I told him that 3 years ago he'd sat in that boardroom, and told me it was just business. I said he was right. It was just business. I'd built something and he'd taken it, and that was business. I told him this was also just business, that I wasn't destroying anything, that I was simply no longer protecting something that had been taken from me. He said that wasn't the same thing. I said I knew. We stood there in the quiet for long enough that the rain on the window became the loudest thing in the room. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He said Tyler had asked about me last week. I stayed at the window. The door closed behind him, quietly, the way he'd always closed doors even as a child. I stood there another few minutes, and then I picked up his untouched cup and poured the tea down the drain, and that was that. The company restructured under debt pressure 4 months later. Marcus lost controlling interest to the investors, still CEO, technically, but on terms he hadn't written. The Columbus facility stayed mothballed. 34 workers were let go. I'd heard 57 from Marcus that night in my kitchen. The difference between those 2 numbers bothered me in a way I didn't have a clean explanation for, and still does. Diane called 6 months after the restructure. I almost didn't pick up. She didn't ask me to fix anything or reverse anything or make a phone call. She said Marcus talked about me every day, and she thought I should know that, not to make me feel guilty, just because she thought I should know. I asked how Tyler was. She said he was good, that he asked sometimes why Grandpa didn't come anymore, and that they told him I'd been busy. I told her that was kind of her. She said my name then, first time she'd ever called me Ray instead of something more formal, and told me Marcus had been wrong, that she'd told him that herself. Then she said, he was still my son. I said I knew. She said okay and hung up, and I stood in the kitchen for a while after, not doing anything in particular. Some conversations end before they're finished. That one ended exactly where it needed to. I took Tyler's drawing off the refrigerator. He'd made it 2 years ago, small boat on blue water, his handwriting along the bottom. Data's boat, the As still backwards the way they are when kids are learning. I looked at it for a moment, and put it back exactly where it had been. The next morning I made 1 cup of coffee. Same kitchen, same table, same chair Marcus had sat in the night he came to ask for help. His chair was still pulled out slightly from when he'd left. I'd had months to push it in. I looked at it for a moment and left it. Through the window the rain had stopped, and the street was still wet, but the sky was clearing. A kid from down the block rode his bike, deliberately through a puddle. Circled back, did it again. I watched him and something in my chest loosened slightly. The way things do when you see someone enjoying something simple, without knowing you're watched. I drank my coffee. Marcus's chair was still pulled out. I don't think I was keeping it for him. I think I was keeping it as evidence, proof that something happened here, that it mattered, That I didn't imagine the 40 years or the board meeting or the kitchen or any of it. Most mornings the coffee gets cold before I finish it. Some mornings it doesn't. That's the whole story, really. That's enough.